The text from Joshua this morning talks about the journey, the pilgrimage journey of the children of Israel toward the land of promise, and it tells us that along that way, Joshua instructed the tribes of Israel to do something that made note of their journey, to take stones, 12 of them representing each tribe, from the middle of the Jordan, and then to bring them onto the other side and to create a monument. And Joshua understood the importance of that moment, because even though their journey was yet unfolding, he wanted to make certain that when others, generations from now, came back to wonder about this moment, they'd have a story to be able to tell when somebody would ask, "What do these stones mean?" Because they would look on, and these would have been stones, piles of stones left by others who'd gone before them. And all that they would have by that is the testimony of a faithful and powerful God, a God who in the midst of their sojourn and their journey did not change, and a God in the midst of your journey who does not change. We need to understand before we go any further, even though we're talking about an expanse of 130 years, and there is much change that we will talk about in a moment, but maybe we ought to start by the understanding that in the midst of all of that change, in the midst of all of those things that have been overwhelming by way of how they are a world different from the way in which your forebears started this proposition back in 1887, that the same God who spoke into their hearts, the same God who gave them direction, the same God who sustained them in their journey, that same God is the very same God who hears us this morning, and that God does not change. And there's some propositions about our relationship with that God we ought to understand before we go any further, that even in the span of 130 years have not changed. Jesus is a wonderful Savior that has not changed. God is faithful. That has not changed. His mercies endure forever. That has not changed. We serve a risen Savior. That has not changed. In my Father's house are many mansions. That has not changed. God's promise to us is that He is with us always, even to the end of the age, and that has not changed. And all things work together for good to those who are called according to the purposes of God. That has not changed. So even as we come to this moment and we celebrate how God has abided with you throughout all of these many, many generations, we understand that the reason we have cause for celebration is because the same God who was faithful even some 130 years ago is the very same God who is faithful now. So the children of Israel and their journey raised these stones from the River Jordan, and the power and the impact of what these stones would mean would be the story that would be told when the question was asked, what do these stones mean? And I propose to you this morning that those stones, as simple as they might have been, had a powerful metaphorical, symbolic impact. And maybe the very same thing that they would mean to the forthcoming generations of the children of Israel are the very same things that they ought to mean to us. And maybe as you look around you here this morning and think about this edifice, but understand that this church is not this edifice, but you can also ask the question, what do these stones mean? Maybe these stones serve as a shelter. Maybe these stones serve as a foundation. Maybe these stones serve as a guidepost. We need to understand this morning that when we trust God for God's abiding presence, God is indeed a shelter in the time of storm. So maybe these stones have been that shelter for you. Maybe we understand that these stones represent a monument to what God has done, but also a guidepost to what God will do. You see, the early history of Israel was punctuated with one miracle after another. The parting of the waters of the Jordan was one of those miracles. From the miracles of the plagues in Egypt and the parting of the Red Sea, the quail and the manna and the waters of Marah and the wilderness, and now the parting of the Jordan, Joshua could see God's hand in delivering, protecting, and providing for the children of Israel. Now, it may seem unusual to have to remind ourselves of this, but sometimes we have to go back and understand that we every now and then forget the blessings that God has given us. And Joshua was not so concerned about his generation because they had been surrounded by this powerful presence of God's glory in deliverance and sustaining. What they had witnessed, he felt they could never forget. What Joshua realized that it's often not so with those subsequent generations. So Joshua wanted to make sure that those who came after, if they asked the question, what do these stones mean? Somebody'd be able to say that these stones, Union, are etched out of the hard scrabble of Christian witness in the face of the currents of an unfriendly history. You know, some people say that some things change and some things remain the same. And I was doing a little background research the other morning, and I went to that font of great preaching wisdom, Google. And I found something out. Some things change, but some things remain the same. In 1887, the President of the United States was from the state of New York. In 1887, the President of the United States from the state of New York was wrapped up in scandal. Some things change. Some things remain the same. We need to understand this morning that in the sweep of history, sometimes things will surprise us, but then sometimes things will be, yes, painfully familiar. So when somebody asks the question, Union, what do these stones mean? The first place you can stop on the journey of answering that question is to say to them, these stones are a memorial. And what do I mean by that? I mean that one of the things we ought to be able to do as we lay claim to our faith is to tell the story, to call the names. Because, beloved, you need to understand, now maybe some of the younger folk in the congregation won't get this, but, you know, there was a movie actor by the name of John Wayne. And John Wayne, in all of his movies, he always saved the day. It didn't matter whether or not the Native Americans were already there. John Wayne saved the day. It didn't really matter, but John Wayne came through. So here's my point. Unless we know how to articulate our story, unless we know how to call the names, unless we know how to raise up what it is we've done, then John Wayne is always the hero, and John Wayne is not always the hero. So we need to understand this morning that we call the names, we call the witnesses of those who've gone before us. So we need to understand that these stones, yes, are a memorial to those who've gone before, those who knew how to pray. Maybe their adjectives and their subjects and their verbs didn't always match up, but they knew how to trust in the Lord with all their heart and lean not to their own understanding. Maybe they didn't have some of the things that you all have. As a matter of fact, I know they didn't have some of the things that you have today, but yet they knew to trust in God and abide with Him throughout the journey. So we ought to make sure that this memorial, if you will, points to the witness and the legacy of those who came before us and who prayed in the face of unimaginable odds, but trusted God's faithfulness nevertheless. It says over in Revelation 7, then one of the elders answered, saying to me, who are these arrayed in white robes, and where do they come from? And I said to him, sir, you know. And he said to me, these are the ones who came out of the great tribulation and washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Oh, make sure to be able to tell the stories of those who've gone before. Make sure to be able to tell the stories of those who prayed for you when you couldn't pray for yourself, who made a way for you when you couldn't make a way for yourself. And these stones, if you will, speak to us about the fact that we didn't get here by ourselves. You know what? For every hand of hue that holds a briefcase walking down Wall Street. There were hands that held brooms and shovels. There were hands that dusted off other people's furniture and rocked other people's babies. You better be thankful for those who come before you. So these stones represent what those who went before us were able to do in the midst of what now to us would seem like unimaginable circumstances. We're called to remembrance of God's faithfulness and the legacy of God's unending love. But along with being a memorial, these stones are a foundation upon which you'd better stand. Oh, when the winds of adversity buffet us, you better be able to put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. And after having done everything else, to stand. You ought to be able to understand that these stones, if nothing else, better be your foundation in the midst of the turbulence that surrounds us. Pastor alluded to it just a few moments ago, and what's so amazing and what's so overwhelming is that even as you just alluded to the few travesties and the few traumas and the few tragedies that you spoke to, that's only the tip of the iceberg. We move about in this day and age when it's absolutely understood that young black men and young black women find themselves at the peril of the indiscretion of those who we would like to trust as law enforcement. We find ourselves being the subject of a criminal justice system that does not have equity or parity or justice in mind. Oh yes, we need a foundation because the winds of adversity buffet against us. Yes, we've made progress. Yes, we can lay claim to successes that we never had before. I thank God for being able to, and that was even only a partial assemblage of the names of those who were elected on this past Tuesday, but we understand that even in the midst of that, challenge and adversity still confronts us. So these stones, born out of our faith, born out of our trust, better be that foundation upon which we stand, to be braced and have a sure footing, to be strong in the Lord, speaking truth to power. Strong foundations are important. Before my wife and our daughters, before we moved to Manhattan, we lived in suburban Maryland, just outside of D.C. in Silver Spring. And in our backyard, we had a number of trees, not large trees, but a number of trees. And I fashioned myself a good and conscientious homeowner. So I made my way to Home Depot one afternoon, and I bought a chainsaw. And I knew that I was going to go in the back and do some landscaping and realigning of things. And my wife looked on prayerfully and nervously from the patio door. And so I was outside, and I had the chainsaw, and I was looking at the instructions, and it said to be sure to read the instructions closely, lest you run the risk of severe injury or possibly even death. And so one of the instructions was to have your feet planted firmly before you started up the chainsaw. Now, the activity, if you will, or the work that the chainsaw would have been involved in would have been productive and meaningful work, but it was significant work, and if I didn't do it right, it could have been damaging. And I read those instructions again, and it said, if you don't want to kill yourself, plant your feet firmly. So I looked at that chainsaw, and I looked at those trees. Does anybody want to buy an unused chainsaw from Home Depot? I understood in that moment that when we take on significant tasks, when we take on challenges, we'd better have our footing founded and firm and planted in the Lord. You know why? And not just simply because of the adversity that we can see, but the adversity that comes to us from unexpected places. Folk who will try to sow seeds of doubt and resignation. Folk who will try to make you think that the battle is lost before it's even fought. Folk who will try to make you think that those enemies at your door are bigger than you can take on. But I serve a God who has told me that the battle is not mine, it is the Lord's. So these stones, the faithfulness of God's power and presence in your midst, are the foundation upon which you need to stand. How can you do all this work? You can do it because you're standing on the firm foundation of God's unwavering power and presence in your life. All these stones, oh yes, they're a memorial. And yes, they are, most importantly, yes, indeed, a foundation upon which we stand. But these stones also, yes, they're a shelter. For you here at Union, they're very much literally a shelter as you extend yourselves to those who are homeless in your community. But even beyond that, the church ought to always be that, and oh, would to God that our far right, and I painfully hesitate to use the word evangelical, but our far right evangelical friends, if they could only understand that you do a travesty to the legacy and the purposes of Jesus when you make the church a place of division, a place of rejection, a place of polarization. And not only that, but when you make it a place that decides that you want to side along power and empire as opposed to doing the work that Jesus would have you to do. I'm going to tell you right now, as I watch the news coverage and whatever, and I've seen some of these preachers, and they saddle up alongside where they are, and all those rooms, I've been in those rooms, all those places, I've been in those places. But one thing I could tell you without hesitation, I would never have continued to stand alongside or work alongside the people that for the last 8 years I was privileged to work alongside closely if I had thought for any one moment that their objective and their aim was to do harm, was to sow seeds of discord, and how somebody can twist and mutilate the gospel for political purposes. How people can say some of the unconscionable things that have just been said in the last couple of days down in the state of Alabama is beyond me. So I want you to understand this morning, I want you to know that in the midst of that kind of onslaught, we better be standing on a firm foundation. But these stones are a place that beckons the brokenhearted. These stones are a place that calls to shelter those who are in the midst of the storms of life. So as a gathered body of believers, when someone says, what do these stones mean? You ought to be able to say collectively, come all you who are heavy laden, and the God we serve in this place will give you rest, will give you comfort, and will give you joy, unspeakable joy. Don't worry if they don't look like Union has always looked. Don't worry if they don't act like Union has always acted. Because the last time I checked, I serve a God who can turn midnight into morning, who can take death and make it life, who can take sorrow and make it joy. So therefore, the proposition I make to you is this, that if we understand that this place, that what we are as God's people is a shelter for all of those who are the most unlike you, when they come in, it'll be a marvelous thing to see what God can do in their lives. Well, I know it's not easy, but that's why you don't have to do the work. It's the transformative power of that Holy Spirit who transformed you and transformed me. So these stones ought to be a shelter for those who don't have anywhere else to go, those who've been kicked out of wherever else they've been. These stones ought to be a shelter that speak to comfort and encouragement, because that's what you've received fully and freely. So yes, Union, it's wonderful to know that these stones are memorial, and you can call the roll of all of those who've gone before, and God's faithfulness has never wavered. Yes, these stones are a foundation upon which Those before you have stood and which you now must stand in the midst of adversity as it confronts you. And yes, these stones indeed are a shelter that welcome and beckon those who've been rejected and cast aside in so many other places. But maybe one thing that we need to really remember, because when somebody talks about a stone monument or a memorial, sometimes we think about it in a static kind of context. But you need to understand something. These stones, in their purest purpose, as Joshua designed it, were simply meant to be a marker of the journey. In other words, those stones were not the end of the journey. They were the midst of the journey. So, Junior, where you've come these 130 years is, thanks be to God, not the end of the journey, but the midst of the journey. And I read ahead, and guess what I found out? It hath not yet appeared what you shall be. Aren't you glad this morning that the God who took what was nothing and turned it into something 130 years ago is able to do that even yet still this morning? Aren't you glad that the very God you serve is the very God who pulled those folk along? And so throughout those 130 years, instead of simply looking back and seeing it as history, I'd see each one of those moments as a point at which God pushed God's people along, pushed them into new opportunities, new possibilities, new vistas, new frontiers. So understand that these stones are a marker for the journey. Now, let me tell you something. Let's go back to Home Depot for just a minute. If you do want to do some landscaping, and you go to that section where they have the landscaping stones, they'll have different kinds and different categories. And I found, I don't know about here in New Jersey, but I found in Maryland that if you wanted the stones that were known as riverbed stones, they would cost a little more. And you almost kind of had to wonder, well, why would they cost more? Well, then upon closer examination, you would see that those stones actually had a depth and an inherent beauty to them that some of the other stones did not have. And the colors even sort of came out in those stones a bit more so. And the reason that is because they had spent their time, if you will, in the turbulence, in the difficulty, in the adversity of the riverbed. And so it tells me that sometimes when you go through a little something or the other, you'll come out shining, giving God the glory for what you've been through. So when somebody says, what do these stones mean? Maybe you can say to them, it means I've been through something, but God has never failed me. When somebody says, what do these stones mean? It means that I've been through some midnight hours, but I can still shine because the power of God is shining in me. So understand, these stones are a marker for the journey, pointing you as God's people forward. Pointing it in all of those who come alongside you forward. Some through the waters, some through the flood, some through the fire, but all through the blood. Some through great sorrow, but God gives us song in the night season and all the day long. I want to go where these stones are pointing me to the promises of God, pointing me to the surety of God, pointing me to the faithfulness of God, the strength of God, the sheltering of God. What do these stones mean? The good news is this, that you don't have to be the soloist in answering that question. You can be part of the chorus, because there are those who come before you who can tell folk that these stones mean that God has never failed. There are those who are going to yet come who'll be able to say that these stones were a shelter in the time of my own storms. So, Union, 130 years has come and gone, but keep building. Keep allowing God to use you in new ways and new possibilities. Let these stones point toward the future that God is shaping and planning for you in this ministry. God is still doing the miraculous. Keep building. God is still carrying us over stormy Jordans. Keep building. God is there in the midst of someone's loneliness. Keep building. Someone still needs to hear the good news. Because while others try to tear down, you keep building. What do these stones mean? They mean ain't gonna nobody turn me around. What do these stones mean? They mean in the midst of the midnight hour, God speaks into my heart. So somebody's gonna ask you, and oh yes, Pastor, you can give them a profound and deeply theological response, and that's all right. And we can talk about the implications of the gospel, and we can use Talikian and Niburian and Bultmannian prefaces. And that's all right for certain places. Maybe when I go back to Union, that's the way I'll talk. But when I find somebody in the midst of need, I'll be able to say, these stones are a shelter in the time of storm. When I find somebody who's lost their way, I'll be able to say, these stones point you to the good news. When I find somebody who knows that the buffeting of the world around them would knock them down, I'll be able to tell them, these stones are a foundation upon which you can stand. Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a shelter in the time of storm. What do these stones mean?